This is the first in the series, the annual series in the Institute of African Studies, the Brown Bag Seminar Series. And I'm very pleased to welcome colleague Evelyn Namakula, who is an assistant professor in the Institute of Interdisciplinary Studies at Carleton. And she's going to be giving the first talk. So first, I'd just like to mention, you saw that the talk is being recorded. So if you're not comfortable being recorded, just you can keep your camera off. And when the question period time comes, I will ask Evelyn questions that appear in the chat, or you can ask your questions directly to Evelyn. And to preserve the internet stability, we'll keep our cameras off while Evelyn is speaking. I will be monitoring the chat, and Evelyn will speak for about 40 minutes, and then I will go through the questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and ask your question directly to Evelyn during the question period. Okay, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Evelyn Namakula, Assistant Professor in the Institute of Interdisciplinary Studies at Carleton. And Evelyn was the recipient of the 2020-2021 James Rosenau Postdoctoral Fellowship from the International Studies Association. And her doctoral thesis, titled People's Experiences, Perceptions and Images of Conflict and Peace Building in South Kivu, Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, received the University of Manitoba's Distinguished Dissertation Award. And Evelyn will be speaking today on the subject of precarity of women and children, mining for renewable energy and tech industries, the case of the DRC. So I would like to pass it over to you, Evelyn. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Christine, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this brown bag lecture. And thanks to our audience. Thank you for being here. We appreciate that. As Christine has mentioned, I'm addressing mining, its precarity on women and children. And what do they do with this mining? They're extracting the mineral that all of us are benefiting from. And today we are in the era where we are all dreaming about renewable energies. But I'm wondering, do we know where the minerals that are used in making those green energy or renewable energy products come from? I will be using slides, and so let me just share my screen here. Christine has already mentioned the topic, so I jump that and go straight into what I'm going to do. I would like to start by asking you questions, and you can just throw your response in the chat. How many of you own cell phones and computers? And we are using a computer even for our presentation. I like that. Is there anyone here who doesn't own a cell phone? And how many are driving electronic vehicles or are eager at least to own one? So Peter, I don't see your hands. But how many know where and how the materials or the minerals that are used to make the phones, computers, cameras, electronic vehicles, solar panels, lithium batteries come from? How are they being obtained? And how many have ever met people who are mining those minerals? Leave aside, maybe we have met corporations, maybe CEOs of mining corporations in Canada or any other country where we are. but I'm referring to grassroots people who are involved into that, doing that tedious work of mining, both industrially and artisanally. I do most of my work in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and this is just a picture to see how the situation looks like. This is artisanal mining. What do I mean by artisanal mining? Is where people use rudimentary methods. As you can see, they have hoes and shovels. They dig holes, go in these pits, sometimes something like 7 to 100 meters down under the ground to collect the minerals, and then they bring them to the surface, wash them in all these basins that you see. But from the beginning, I want to draw your attention to the conditions around this mining industry. Look at the houses where people live, but how much does a cell phone cost? How much does an electronic vehicle cost? How much do solar panels cost? From the beginning, we are realizing that the revenues that are coming from all of the products do not trickle down to the people who work so hard. I remember once I entered one of those tunnels, you can hardly breathe when you're under those tunnels. After that short introduction, which I will continue briefly, I'll go into the theoretical framework that I use when I'm doing this research, the methodology and methods briefly, how mining is in Sub-Saharan Africa, mining in the DRC during the colonial era, post and to the present, and why women and children are in mining, children and women's work and the conditions under which they work, and some of the findings, recommendations, and what I suggest to be areas for future research. My argument during this presentation is that the DRC is endowed with the world's minerals that are demanded for technological industries and for renewable energy today. But mining has failed to generate income for local communities. People live in abject poverty. And besides unregulated mining practices, they are destroying people because, for example, if an industrial company owns a mining, all the villages around are displaced. Water sources are destroyed with pollution and toxic acids. Plantations, everything that enables communities to survive get destroyed with the mining, with the industrial mining. And so then people are left only with poverty. And when all that is happening, the natural environment is degraded. So then we have a cycle of poverty, industrial degradation, but also violence, because in the DRC, since 1996, armed groups are the ones involved into extracting the minerals, sometimes using local people. And we have come to a level where even mining companies, 63% of which are in Canada, are sometimes employing armed groups to offer them protection and in exchange for minerals or guns, name it. So it has become a barter trade on the lives of the vulnerable people, majority of whom are women and children. The question that I want us to think about, we might not be able to answer them, is then how can we advance grassroots agency, cultures, and indigenous knowledge to engender homegrown governance mechanisms, policies, and practices that reinforce people's livelihoods, security, and environmental sustainability? Why do I focus so much on these grassroots agency and homegrown approaches? Because international mechanisms have failed to emancipate people, and the governance around the supply chain is always favoring the developed world and consequently underdeveloping, exploiting people in the developing world. Another question is, how effective is the federal government call for Canada to play a global leadership role in implementing corporate social responsibility in mining? Since 2021, the Canadian government called upon all Canadian mining companies to be on the forefront of implementing corporate social responsibility, which briefly means that then revenues have to be returned to, at least part of the revenues have to be returned to developing local communities. There should be care for the environment, etc. But when you go on the ground, I find that all this remains a political or hegemonic narrative, but the reality on the ground remains very dire. The theoretical framework that I use is multidisciplinary because I'm a multidisciplinary scholar. And I always take this narrative because, as I always say, I've been educated both in Africa and in the West, and I have a lot of experience. So all that experience becomes part of my approach to research and education. I've been to more than 53 countries, and you find that there's a narrative that is really augmenting all this exploitation, which dates back to the colonial period. And as we know, from the colonial era, the colonizers were taking resources away from Africa, bringing them to the West. That has not changed. Resources, minerals are continuously being taken away and brought to the West. And the narrative that is being built around that is that, yeah, those are developing countries, they are poor. But what is forgotten most of the time is that in the developing world, we have become rich and poor, very rich and sophisticated on the misery, suffering, exploitation, and the plundering of the resources of the people in the developing world. And mostly Africa is very rich with the minerals, but the people there are not benefiting from the minerals at all. And so that is the framework that I use to ensure that it is high time that we accord agency to the local people, that exploitation has to stop. The second one that I use is decolonization, because as we know that colonialism destroyed people's minds in the first place. For example, it always baffles me to find Congolese men and women using guns to kill their own people, taking the minerals that would have reinforced national growth and development and selling them cheaply to the Western world. I'm not against the Western world's development. I'm not against development anywhere, but when it comes to violent exploitation, I think it should be concerning. And that's where then I look at this decolonization as a strategy that is required, first of all, to decolonize the mind of the African people, to realize that they have to play a role in developing their countries, in developing the entire continent. And for me, Africa will not develop unless if they learn how to utilize their resources well. Another theoretical framework that I use is at emancipatory peace, security, and social justice. That, for example, when we talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the responsibility to protect, it has to be emancipatory and not just Eurocentric. It has to become real in people's day-to-day lives. And the third one is the conflict and the war framework, where you find that conflicts and the wars have become the modus operandi of accessing resources in Africa. You look at countries like Sub-Saharan, Central Africa's Republic, Mali, Western Sahara, Angola, Liberia. In all those places, war and conflicts have been deployed to extract the minerals and other natural resources. And Laurie in 2000 wrote this book, which I loved so much, and he talks about the horsemen of the apocalypse, which is very, very applicable to mineral extraction, where we have authoritarian rule in many African countries, where people are excluded from government. Governments are there as it were during the colonial era, that they are not serving the common good. People do not feel that sense of belonging to the governments. And those governments are again operating according to the Western narrative. Take the example of democracy. How can we talk about democracy when the resources do not benefit the local people? When the local people do not have a say in the governance of their own countries? The third horseman is the socio-economic deprivation and the inequality, very real. Africa is known. When you look at the Global Development Index, many African countries are always at the lowest level of development. And finally, we have weak states. But for me, all of these are like ploys being used to extract the resources that we adamantly desire. The methodology that I use is a critical ethnography that aims at, again, raising people's critical approach to life and at the same time empowering them, taking them away from that colonial approach to life to the African approach to life. And that brings me to the second one, Indigenous Methods, where I look at people's cultures, epistemologies, customs, and worldview as the sources for their liberation, and these are the sources that should be used even when it comes to mineral governance and mineral exploitation. Because, for example, when you look at how African indigenous people approached mining, it was always in line with caring for the common good. Environmental destruction was never allowed. Exploitation of women was never allowed. So probably it is high time that we empower people to return to those indigenous values that kept communities going for millions and millions of years. That brings me to how then mining is done in Sub-Saharan Africa. Probably we know that Sub-Saharan Africa possesses about 30% of global minerals, and about 8,000, this is a statistic of 2018, 8,360 people, 1,000 people in Sub-Saharan Africa are involved in mining. And you can see that from West Africa, Nigeria, all those countries around there, also in Eastern Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, there are so many people involved in mining, and also part of the North, countries like Sudan, South Sudan, there are so many people involved into mining. But going back to what I said before, you find that those are all the countries today entangled into violence. It's like every country rich with minerals, oil, name it, is experiencing war. But at the same time, you find these people are struggling to earn a living, either working with industrial miners or working independently as artisanal miners. 40 to 50% of the workforce in this mining industry are women. And gradually, children have become part and parcel of the labor force. However, this phenomenon is not widely publicized because, for example, when I visit the mines, children are hidden. People know that children are not allowed to work in the mines, so they always hide them. And so then you find that we have data which is devoid of children's exploitation and abuses in mining. This is what we see. These are some of the pictures. One is from Ghana, another is from Liberia. When I was there, those are some of the pictures I took. And this one is from Tanzania, a place called Geita. Children digging for gold along the river. There's a lot that would have said about mining in Sub-Saharan Africa, but because of time, I want to zero in into what is happening to the DRC. The DRC is one of the richest countries on, I would say, on this planet. but it is also one of the poorest. And you wonder which rubric do we use in us determining which country is rich and which country is poor. In 2021, this study was done first in 2012, but again in 2021, that Congo has approximately something like a $24 trillion, which could be the GDP of Europe and America, owned by just one country. It is home to 70% of the world's cotton, the cotton that we use in our cell phones and computers. It has the planet's diamond reserves, but I want to draw your attention to this 70% of world's cobalt and copper, which today is highly demanded for electronic vehicles, solar panels, and lithium batteries. So then you find that mining companies, artisanal miners, they are all in a place mostly called the Katanga region, which connects Congo to the Green Belt and Zambia and Zimbabwe, all exploiting the cobalt, copper, and lithium, and so many other minerals in that country. For those who do not know where Congo is, this is the country. This map was taken in 2000 some time back. I couldn't find a recent one. So it is in between Sudan, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, Zambia. But I want to draw your attention to these minerals here: diamonds, gold, cotton, copper, cobalt, tin, manganese, name it. And there are so many other minerals that have not yet been discovered in the DRC. Since the colonial era, Congo was a reservoir of precious resources, copper, gold, zinc, etc., which the Belgians and the US and other countries were exploiting, taking away into the developed world. And maybe some of you have read that book, I think by Engler, Canada in Africa, 300 years of aid and exploitation. 300 years is a very long time of exploitation. And this started during this era of colonization, because even Canada was supporting Britain during that colonial period. In 1906, King Leopold, I don't like to call him king because at least from the African perspective, normally kings are very respectable and respectful towards their people. So Leopold II of Belgium was shipping about 600 ounces of gold monthly. We are talking about 1906, and up to today, gold is still being exploited from the Congo. This is a lot taken out of a country. And between 1887 and 1953, Belgium's outflow from Congo was around 4,300 million pounds. Around this time, how much would that be today? So then we have countries that have become rich from exploiting Congo's resources. When you travel to Belgium, you find areas, I don't remember, there are two towns that I have visited, where people do not work. All their resources come from exploiting other countries, and mostly from the DRC. And sometimes I wonder then, where is justice? Where is human rights? Where is the responsibility to protect when exploiters and the plunderers are not called to account? During the colonial period, when Leopold was exploiting the resources, this was happening to people. In case men failed to produce rubber, the minerals that were required, he was amputating their hands. This brutality is unimaginable, but it has not yet ended, because today, not only the hands are being amputated, but people are being massacred with guns in the bid to extract the minerals. When Congo became independent in 1960, they had the famous President Desire Mobutu. He tried to dismantle industrial mining, But in order to continue receiving foreign aid from the US and other European countries, he allowed American companies to continue extracting Congo's minerals. And in 1982, Mobutu tried to combine artisanal mining and industrial mining and allowed or liberalized artisanal mining, allowing local people to benefit kind of from their resources. So then people started, men, women, and even children already at this time were involved into artisanal mining, and were trading gold, diamonds, and other minerals through illegal channels. Minerals were being taken out of the DRC through Uganda, Congo, and Tanzania. Since 1998, the number of men, women, and children in mining has increased. Why do I emphasize 1998? Because for those who are familiar with the Congo's history, from 1996, Rwanda and Uganda invaded the Congo, and during that time they discovered Congo's riches and they started mining. You find that, for example, today there is a case, Uganda has a case at the ICC for plundering Congo's minerals. Rwanda did the same, and during that time, Rwanda became the global producer of cotton, and nobody investigated where Rwanda's reservoirs of cotton were. None. Later on, they found a few somewhere near Kabugeta, but it was incomparable to the trillions and trillions of dollars that Rwanda accrued from exporting cotton to the Western world. When mining is happening, this is what happens. This is a picture I took from Banro Mining. It's a Canadian mining company. What do? They have their edifice over here, but before they constructed this edifice, the villages that were all here were displaced. I want to draw your attention to this level of environmental degradation that we have here. Hills are being wiped out. That today, even if Banro is claiming to leave Congo, what they have created will haunt Congo forever. And this is one, but all mining companies, and I go back to what I said earlier, that 63%, at least the data that I checked recently, 63% of mining companies, they have their bases in Toronto. You can see that on the Toronto, how they call Toronto Exchange. There's a term that I've forgotten there. It shows you how much we are earning from the minerals. This is in Katanga where cobalt is being mined. Again, I want to draw your attention to this level of environmental degradation and deprivation, because when mining companies take over an area, they fence it. So then the local people they are considered actually illegal if they go into this mining to scavenge at least for cobalt or cotton or whatever has remained. So then hundreds and hundreds of acres of land are fenced. And let's remember that before there were people living here, but they get displaced when a mining company takes over. The data that I have is from 2016, where you find that these are the mines that are found in the DRC, so many of them, and these are the miners. The number keeps growing. Again, the mines and the miners. 2020, and this is only for gold. I didn't look at other minerals, only for gold. These are the mines and then the number of miners, men and women. As I mentioned earlier, violence has been used to access Congo's resources. I met these children, that was in 2016. They are used most of the time to guard a mining area, to go and raid villages bring women, children, and men to work in the mines. And the question that I always ask myself that if, for example, these were Canadian children, would the world have allowed this to continue? But when it comes to Congo and maybe other African countries, the world seems not to care. Whereas we say we have rights for children from the United Nations. But which children are we talking about? Because I'm afraid to say, but I dare say it, that we have preferred minerals to children. And when I talked to some of those children, they told me, you know what, hunger and poverty brings me into mining. And that child had just left because there is a Catholic organization called the Justice and the Peace Commission for Peace in Eastern Congo, and they tried to take our children from armed groups. And one of those boys told me that, you know what, even after leaving war, and now I'm struggling to mine, if poverty continues, it will send me back to killing people because life is very difficult. And he said, you know, we throw our slaves in mining and the military, referring to armed groups, not because we like it, but we are unemployed, we are starving, we are poor, we have no education. But you also acknowledge that during war, many things go on and they eat your soul, even after, because he was talking about failure to sleep, remembering all what happened during war. But they cannot prevent me from returning to the bush instead of continuing to live in this misery. I earn very little as a miner, whereas as a soldier, I used to earn something like $100 a month. These are some of the women I work with. All of these children are under the care of this woman. These two belong to a sister who died during an armed group attack. These are hers. I just wonder, how are these children going to survive when even today, as we are talking, their conditions of living have not improved. And if you realize, this child here has another one at the back, because when the mother died, this one, the one at the back, was only 2 months. Again, I go back to Banro's work. The picture I showed you, this is Banro's complex. The destruction that is being done here. Communities have been displaced. And what did Banro do? They constructed an area here, far away from the mining area, and put up these houses for people to live in. But for those who have been to Africa, you find, and in Congo it is a culture, people's homes are not small. They have a sitting room, they have a kitchen, they have a house for boys, another one for girls, etc. But instead, what the mining company did after taking away their land, they built this kind of houses, only a sitting room, a bedroom, a kitchen out here, or not yet, a kitchen out here, and a toilet here. Everything is like this. This is the hill where people have been displaced from here and brought here. So then it is like they are living in a refugee camp, but this is the life that they are going to live for the whole of their life. So then indirectly, it's like, because this is from the Canadian perspective, we are trying to create reserves, kind of, because when you go to communities where indigenous people live, it is more or less like this, small houses. And we expect the people to survive on this. And what maybe eats me up more is that failure to have that morality and upright consciousness to return what has been exploited, even if 50%, to elevate the living conditions of these people. So then land has been taken away, minerals are taken away. And remember, when they're displaced, their plantations or their original sources of income are being destroyed. Again, these are women and children in mining. Here they are trying to scavenge for gold. Up here, there's that Banro mining, so whatever flows from Banro, then women are here. See how they are using their hands, touching this toxic water, and some of them, at the end of the day, they develop all kinds of sicknesses, including cancer. Again, the same women struggling to find something to survive, pounding stones, sometimes even pounding their fingers and nails in the process. And these women will tell you, if I don't do this, my children will have nothing to eat, or they will not be able to go to school. Others, when they're not in mining, they're involved into prostitution, selling basic commodities of food, alcohol, name it. And remember that when the miners are not also earning much, they don't buy what these women are selling. So then we have a vicious cycle of poverty. These are some of the youth and the children working in mining. These are miners taking it from the tunnels, and these are porters. This one I think was 13 when I met them. I asked whether they ever go to school, and they said yes, sometimes, but even if you go to school, you don't really learn much, because one day in a school an armed group will attack and your education will never continue. So then let's go and work in the mines. Again, children working under pathetic conditions in the minerals. This boy was only 15 when I interviewed him. That was in 2017. What do I find out in all this research? That the mine conditions of militarism and exploitation are connected to the colonial legacy that is still haunting Congo and the rest of Africa. Mining remains also a male-dominated and colonized industry because they are the men in government working with the CEOs of mining companies to control the mining process. Some women become successful as they try to navigate the system, which is not easy. And the majority of women are involved in this artisanal mining, not so much into industrial mining. And sometimes mining offers women the new sources of income if they are successful. But we also have to remember that they are working their heads off to feed the global technological economy, while at the same time remaining exploited, earning less than $5 a week. Some of these women are porters, they carry water, they grind the minerals, they do everything around the minerals, and they end up earning only $5 a week. Women and children work in dangerous conditions of constant human rights violations, social injustices, and insecurity. Many have been killed in the process. They experience gendered forms of inequality, exclusion, and marginalization, both in industrial and artisanal mining. And today, many women have been also exposed to sexual violence. Many of those who I met are struggling with HIV/AIDS, yet they are very poor. They cannot afford going to hospitals. They have sexually transmitted diseases. And those who I talk to over the phone, they're struggling. Some are also struggling with COVID-19. So there's a lot of misery. And of course, due to this toxic environment, touching water involving cyanide acid, or even the minerals themselves are toxic, pollution, etc. Women, children have developed cancer, infertility. There are some I saw, their skins are like a crocodile. They developed skin rashes, which are difficult even to understand. They have gone to hospitals, but even the doctors in Congo do not understand what is going on. And of course, they also have other complications due to exposure to minerals, mercury, and other toxic acids that are being used in cleaning the minerals. And then women and children in artisanal mining, they suffer also from trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder because of the working condition. But I also find that even those who are employed, those who are working in industrial mining, they also suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma because the working conditions are not favorable. And of course, there's also too much poverty and unemployment, forcing people again to involve themselves into mining. And as mining happens, both artisanally and industrially, communities are destroyed, families are destroyed. For example, when communities are displaced, they will never remain the same. Their cultures are being destroyed. Like one man was telling me that before, when I had my own house, I used to go home, sit around the fireplace and talk. That's what the way of educating my children. But in those small houses that we are built for us, where we don't have even a kitchen, we cannot do that anymore. And of course, we have created regional refugees, which has transpired with a lot of animosity, because when people are displaced, they become refugees within their own country, and gradually they start armed groups, and those armed groups are terrorizing or even the neighboring countries. And of course, they are using the minerals to finance wars, to purchase weapons, name it. So it has become a cycle of exploiting the minerals using violence, and in the process degrading the environment, forcing women and the men and the children to struggle for their survival. And of course, in mining, there's also that struggle for power between men and women. Men want to control the mining industry, and of course, women also need to survive. And most of the time, you find women and children, they live and work in unstable social, political, and socioeconomic conditions. For them, it is only about survival. They don't have possibilities of, for example, opening bank accounts. It is only live for the now. And of course, environmental degradation has become rampant. Forests have been cleared, water and land polluted. Mining codes have been written with the sponsor of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and the mining companies, and even the Canadian government contributed funds in writing these mining codes. But again, those codes, they remain on paper, and they have not made any serious effort to end women and children exploitation and human rights violation. And so then women view their plight as a national crisis of leadership, because many of them were saying, if only we had leaders, they would claim, they would ensure that we benefit from our resources. But the leaders that we have are corrupt, like the colonizers. And even at the regional level, where we have Africa's Great Lakes region leaders, they have also failed to ensure that the resources benefit women and children, and also to mitigate this violent approach to mining. And even the international measures like the OECD or the non-government organization due diligence approaches, they have not really improved governance in the global supply chain to ensure that resources trickle down to local communities and that violence is eliminated in the process. And so then some women were saying that, what is happening to us is really part of the global racism, because if these minerals were being exploited, for them they were saying, if these minerals were in France or in Belgium and women were suffering like us here, the world wouldn't have remained silent. But because we are Africans, nobody cares. And so then I also go back to what I said at the beginning. I think colonialism is part and parcel of this continued exploitation and destruction of the DRC. And we also have that narrative of neo-colonialism that continuously is exploiting resources from the global south. to develop the economies in the global north, and also the element of gendered capitalism where women's voice has no place. And so that brings me to the conclusion that we are experiencing the new scramble for Africa's resources and militarization of Congo, but also the entire continent. I recommend that in order to resolve these conflicts, Congolese and people in Africa, they have to go back and understand their history, because solutions will not come from the liberal narrative or from the West. No, from the, for example, I suggest the Ubuntu philosophy, which valued people and their environment, which valued resources as a common good, instead of this greed of exploiting only for oneself. And so I also suggest Africanized leadership, where natural resource governance will also aim at the well-being of each and every person. 87 of the people interviewed said this. And also the issue of building inclusive and just institutions at national, regional, and international level to address the issues of human rights violations, injustices, and the needs of the local people, particularly women and children. And also ensuring that mining is not militarized, removing soldiers from the mines and control arms proliferation from the neighboring countries of Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Tanzania, and Sudan. And creating better mining conditions, especially for women and children. Establishing a comprehensive approach to peace and security, where women, for example, when they're sexually violated, they will have at least access to justice. But instead in Congo, you find that justice also belongs to the highest bidders, only the rich and those who have positions in politics. There's a need for women's emancipation and gender mainstreaming in mining and in the way we use electronics. And of course, the need for social and economic empowerment for women, and to ensure that they have at least access to public services, starting with access to medical care and the education for their children, but also food and water. Areas for future research then would be ensuring that any research around mining interrogates women's narrative, is gendered, keeps in mind the issues of race and mineral governance in the DRC, including women in politics and policy making and resource governance throughout the supply chain, interconnecting local, national, and regional and international and structural factors facilitating injustices and violence around mineral extraction, to engender justice and human rights in all issues around mining, and also ensuring that how can African indigenous knowledge contribute to emancipating women and children in mining, and also revisiting that colonialism, race, and mineral exploitation connection. When we are doing research on mining, it should never be disconnected to issues of race and colonialism. And thank you very much.
There we go. Thank you very much, Evelyn, for that very clear, crystal clear to me anyway, portrait of the situation and the conditions under which men, women, and children are working in these mines in the DRC, and possible, possible ways forward to remedy the situation. I'd like to open it up to questions. I have one question here that I'll start with from Nancy, and then if anybody else has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or put your hand up and I will call on you. So Nancy writes, such an important area of research and a powerful presentation. How do you think public health associations can or should be involved and mobilized to address these injustices?
Thank you, Nancy, for that question. I'm wondering which public health institutions are you referring to?
I'm sorry, would you repeat your question? I didn't hear the last phrase.
Which public health institutions are you referring to?
I was thinking of either national public health associations or public health associations in other countries that are involved in international work, or the International Association of Public Health Associations. And I'll maybe just maybe it'd be helpful to tell you a bit of the background for my question. So I'm a nurse and an epidemiologist by background. I worked in Sierra Leone for 5 years and saw a little bit of what you're talking about, particularly artisanal diamond mining, which was, there was quite a bit of that in our area. And one of the things that I had done some work on with the Canadian Public Health Association was developing some recommendations related to mining, particularly mining of resources that are being used for all those electronic gadgets that you talked about at the beginning. And we're seeing some real issues increasing, I think, in magnitude rather than decreasing in magnitude as a result. But it really got me wondering more about, how public health associations might get involved. And I think typically they've been very involved in infectious diseases. That's sort of been the tradition. And they have not been involved in the mining sector traditionally. They get involved in water because it's so directly related to health, but there are just so many health issues, as you have eloquently pointed out, and so many injustices that are in the mining sector. So I just wondered if that was something that had come up at all, or you had some thoughts on how public health associations can help. Thanks.
Thank you for that question. And from what you have said, you are giving the example of Sierra Leone, but exactly what you have said is happening in the DRC.
Yes.
And you find that happening in so many other countries. In Congo, there are some public health organizations or associations that have been involved. But what I find is that, for example, we're in Canada and we take the same mentality out there, like trying to transport approach to health that is being practiced in Canada into Sierra Leone or into Congo. I think it doesn't work that way. I would suggest that before we start, for example, any project around public health, we talk to the local people, we talk to women and ask them, what do you need? What should we do with you and not for you? But many times you find that we crafted projects from the global north and they fail to take root when we just transplant them from here to there. And another sad issue, at times you find that, for example, Congo, I dare call it a cemetery, in quotes, of so many non-government organizations. The question is, what are they doing there when the situation has not changed at all? I dare to say, basing on what people told me, that we have sometimes created these non-government organizations also as a source of income for people who are running them. There are some organizations I interviewed in Congo and also in Rwanda and Uganda, and you find that, for example, when money is given to them, 60% goes into administration and only 40 or 30% goes to the grassroots. I think that is an injustice. Involvement is very, very important because, for example, the minerals that are being taken out from Congo, they're benefiting the global society. So it is the global responsibility to emancipate people in the DRC. But I think we need to do it with them.
Yes, those are very important principles. I agree with you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Gavin has two questions. The first one is, you made reference to a few other African countries, including Tanzania. Ghana, and Liberia. How generalizable are your findings from Congo and women and children engaged in artisanal mining specifically for the wider sub-Saharan Africa?
One, as Nancy has mentioned, exactly the example that she has given, you see it happening in Congo. Two, I've been to all those countries and you find the same.
Okay, so the second question that Gavin has is he would like to preface by saying that artisanal mining is the most rural non-farm activity in sub-Saharan Africa. It is interconnected with farming, often seasonally. His question is, what is your position on the formalization of artisanal mining in DRC and wider sub-Saharan Africa?
Formalization has happened, for example, in the DRC. The 2018 mining code formalized mining, but then people not given the resources and the equipments to enable them to carry out mining in a more civilized manner, I would say. So if they remain using rudimentary tools which are endangering their health, it does not work. So then formalization requires that the mode of production changes. And at the same time, formalization of mining will also require that mining companies or industrial mining companies are regulated, because many times you find that when they're in a place, industrial miners have no access to minerals. And of course, mining corporations always have a lot of money and they bribe politicians. The two of them, I think they should be called to account. And so then when they bribe politicians, they dislocate or displace the artisanal miners, and there's no way of formalizing artisanal mining when industrial miners are controlling the trade. When the Canadian government in 2021 announced that Canada should take the responsibility to ensure that corporate social responsibilities implemented 100% even out there, I thought that they are going to go beyond just the narrative and say, okay, how is social responsibility going to be implemented? Again, we are still operating in that, forgive me for calling it a colonial mentality, where we just go and do things for people. I think it is high time where we ask people, what do you want us to do? How do you want us to practice this social responsibility? Not want to do it our way. So then, in that case, formalization requires that people are interrogated at the grassroots, but also taking the findings at the grassroots and bringing them to the global north, and then designing strategies for formalizing industry or artisanal mining. For example, if Canada has to take a role in ensuring corporate social responsibility, they could help artisanal miners with equipments that, instead of, for example, entering tunnels where many times people risk their lives, they could maybe help them with the equipment for digging tunnels. They could help them with machines for pumping oxygen into the machines, into the tunnels. Even helping them with simple things like gloves that they use when they are sorting the minerals. You can't imagine, I met women and even children whose fingertips are all scraped off because of the poisonous minerals that they touch on a daily basis. So then formalization calls for, I would say, first research to see what is needed to formalize it, and practically what does it require.
Thank you for that. And I think Gavin wanted to comment directly. Would you still like to, Gavin?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, no, interesting presentation. Very interesting presentation. I mean, obviously, this is an area which has really polarized the academic community. So, I mean, we have. So I'm just trying to catch my breath there. I was just running after my son. So, yeah, I mean, I don't do work on Congo specifically, but I mean, just a few comments on the issue of child labor and specifically child labor. I mean, what we found is in West Africa, particularly the countries where I work, Mali, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Liberia, you tend to see a lot of children engaged in some of these the so-called light work that is considered light work by the International Labor Organization. So work that is basically not the type of work you would consider hazardous. And when you take into account the broader picture, which is that these two sectors or these two activities are heavily interconnected, and there's a big evidence base which points to that across sub-Saharan Africa. Basically, when you're not mining, you're farming, and when you're not farming, you're mining, and the capital and labor flows back and forth between the sectors ongoingly throughout the year. You can sort of make a convincing argument that what you see with the children is an extension of what you see on the family farm. So this is sort of the debate I've gotten into with some donors who are convinced that, and I'm not sort of denying that a lot of these children are using mercury, for example, in the coal mining sector and engaging in hazardous work. We know about the snake boys in Tanzania going in the tunnels. But I think, this is a very complex issue, and it's much more nuanced than a lot of the, the human rights NGOs have sort of projected or portrayed. On the second issue, formalization, I mean, I find that really interesting. There's a big, you mentioned Canadian companies, and yeah, I mean, this is where everything starts and stops. I mean, we're talking about the vast majority of mining and mineral exploration companies are there. They're listed in Toronto and Vancouver. I mean, 75% of them, or whatever the percentage is. What's really interesting, though, is there's been a big push for these Canadian companies to, not only Canadian companies, just big companies in general, to help these artisanal miners. And as you probably know, in Congo, but you see it across Africa and the countries I work, these huge concessions have been given out to these mining companies and these exploration companies. And I did my first degree a very long time ago in geology, and you know that a lot of the deposits which these miners target are not going to be worked by the mining company. So the small scale miners generally congregate in areas where large mining companies are not interested in sort of working. But the problem is you have a huge concession that's been given out to these mining companies, and that's a process to extract those areas and give them to small scale. I know you have these corridors in the DRC linked to the formalization strategy, but that's a huge issue. And what's really interesting, I'll stop right here, but I mean, what's really interesting with the Canadian companies in particular is, and it's an interesting question, how do you engage these companies knowing that, one, the ownership structure is so complex. You don't know who owns the mine from year to year. And you look at last year, for example, there's something like 10,000 mergers and acquisitions in the mining and mineral exploration sector. You look at the biggest mining companies like Barrick Gold, Toronto-based, merging with Randgold. Who would have predicted that? So obviously that has an impact on managerial structure and what philosophy is considered appropriate at the mine level. And secondly, the whole idea of working with artisanal miners is really interesting because the World Bank is pushing this and the ICMM is pushing this in places like Congo as well. And it raises the question of how do you reconcile, on the one hand, this idea of partnership and this sort of romantic picture of working with artisanal miners and helping them, provide them with equipment, as you've indicated. And on the other hand, what's identified in the sector as the biggest risk for the sector, which is artisanal mining. You go to Indaba, you go to PDAC in Toronto, the number one risk these mining companies identify is artisanal mining. So it's just really interesting. So yeah, that's all I have to say. I could go on forever when it comes to artisanal mining, so I'm going to stop there.
Evelyn, is there anything you'd like to respond to before we go to the next question?
No, I totally agree with what Gavin has said. It is very, very complex. And it all revolves around corruption, money, power, race. But maybe as scholars and the policy, where our scholarship should contribute to policy, is trying to maybe complex, but at least to try to simplify that complexity, if we can. And I think we do that in the measure that we talk to the people on the ground.
Okay, thank you for that. And Jessica is the next question in the queue. How might incorporating Indigenous knowledge and providing equipment to formalize mining work in locations like the DRC, where there is a vacuum of leadership? How do we identify our contacts in the communities who from the grassroots or local government speak with authority for their best interest?
Thank you for the question. I think I go back to what I've been saying all this time, is the finding local community gatekeepers and working with them. And even if colonialism destroyed people's cultures, people's values, they still have some which should be utilized in bettering the mining conditions and the conditions of living that force people into mining under precarious conditions.
Okay, thank you. And the next one is from Toby Morrison. Thank you for the thoughtful and empathetic presentation. I am surprised, however, at the fact your recommendations do not address the weaknesses of the Congolese government. You just now mentioned the bribing of politicians, so a few moments ago. But are there no more ambitious understandings of governance that actually challenge mining companies, which continue to benefit from weak CSR mechanisms that allow formalization to be led by the mining companies themselves? This, to me, seems to be such a limited vision of political independence compared to the aspirations of the 1960s, where governments attempted to broker greater percentages from extractive companies. In the agricultural sector, we are slowly seeing populations demanding more from their governments and expecting them to introduce duties on importers, as one example.
Thank you for that question. I left out the government narrative because it is so broad and complex. And people in Congo, they have, I would say, a kind of mistrust when it comes to governments. And so they don't want to get involved into government. They prefer to do things locally. But then you find that when mining companies go in, of course, the government still has power and mining companies use the government. But for people, the government is not really in the picture most of the time. Of course, we have to acknowledge the weakness of the government. That's where I mentioned the states are not functioning. But I think we can only critique the failing African state if we look at its origin, because from the beginning, the African state was not really created to serve the local people. And that's why I think Davidson calls it the African man's burden. It was created to continue that exploitation, but not empowering the local people. So for me, the state is not yet really in the picture. People have to use their indigenous knowledge, as it were before, if liberation has to take place. Because the state is still serving that hegemonic narrative and not the local people. In Congo, I think as Gavin mentioned, we have the mining code. They're being renewed year after year, but they're not serving the people. There's the justice system where people say, yeah, if you're being, if your women are sexually violated in the mining, you come and report here. The structures for reporting that is not there. It is all on paper. That's why I didn't really waste time talking about the government. No.
Okay, thanks for that. Are there any other questions or anything else, Toby, that maybe you wanted to respond to?
Well, I guess just as a continuation of that, if one is not making, or if there is no evidence of movements that are really demanding more from the government, the question is whether there's any labor-based organizing, and obviously it's this is all really complicated because of that agricultural mining interaction. You know, that these populations are highly informal, and they are not defined by one single job. But in the case of the corporation that took over the hillside and relocated peoples, there's a you know, workers that are in one way or another working for a company, and from what I'm understanding is most of the labor is outsourced, and the companies are outsourcing their own responsibilities towards their workers. But is there not sort of self-mobilization? I guess I'm just asking this in part because one of the strategies that I've been slowly trying to incorporate in my own research and getting around these kind of conundrums of how you be an outsider and get to come in and do research with any organization. But I work with people that are already resisting. So we try to bolster the support of, bolster organizations that are already trying to advocate on behalf of the particular farmers in my case in question. So if one was to try and implement any of those recommendations that you were suggesting, you'd be able to have an already active group of people that can actually start to make good on these things in whatever ways they find possible in their limited social position. I guess I'm just looking for organized resistance that's got some level of hope behind it, rather than sectional and infighting amongst groups that are heavily militarized and violent and perpetuate all of that kind of violence towards women and children that you're trying to advocate against.
Thank you for the question. Yes, there is a bit of organization. For example, artisanal miners have formed, they call them cooperatives, where together, for example, they write letters, or at the beginning they were even attacking mining companies or protesting around mining companies. But then you find that mining companies collaborating with governments are very, very powerful. For example, when people were protesting, the government would send in the police and the military, and they kill people. So then you find people have those local organizations, but they have no power because the government uses violence to suppress them. When you visit many of the mining companies in the DRC, they're all, like the fences I showed you, they're all surrounded by soldiers and the police. So they are not to protect the local community, but to protect the resources of mining companies. So then people are kind of left powerless. and that pains them. That there's this state machinery which is militarized, that the moment they dare speak up, they will be crushed. And you are right, I'm also wondering what should be done to empower people more and more. I think I go back to, I think it was Jessica who posed the question. Probably it is high time we call people in the government to account, to look at what leaders should do for the state. Take the example in Canada. Civilians can call the government to account, but in Congo, no. The moment you dare, you will be crushed. You remember, like when they were preparing for the elections in 2018, how many people were being killed because they were protesting against the government and the government policies. But probably with some more education and empowerment, people will try through failures, and even some might be killed. But I think what is needed is to call government to account. And it is very, very, very difficult throughout Africa, actually. States are not serving their people. No, they work with mining companies, they work with military industries to suppress and to kill civilians. And of course, then mining companies use that loophole in their own favor most of the time. Like when people protested against Banro, I remember that was in 2015 and I was there. About 5 people were killed by the military, sent in by the state. And no investigation has ever been carried out. So then the military and the police commit all those kind of atrocities with impunity in order to protect the resources of the mining companies.
Okay, we have there's a question going back to the question of indigeneity. Blair has said, many thanks for the talk, Eve. I am wondering if you thought through ways of supporting African indigenous knowledge, for it can be a bit of a slippery term. And I know in some mining areas, tradition is often invoked by some male leaders to prohibit women from mining or the more lucrative mining activities. And from my understanding, the politics of autochthony and indigeneity can be quite strong in Eastern DRC. So there can be a worry of promoting indigenous. It can be divisive among different ethnic identifications. In short, it can be a challenge. And Blair is there with his camera on. So if I did not read that properly, you can clarify.
Hi, Blair. Thank you for the question. Yes. And actually, when we talk about indigenous knowledge, not only in the DRC, but throughout Africa, it is complex. Because, for example, in Congo, we are talking about more than 200 ethnic groups. So then, which indigenous knowledge are we going to interrogate here? I dare to say that, at least from the perspective of the people there, they say, you know what? Before, we coexisted peacefully. And we need to bring all our indigenous knowledges into a melting pot and take out what will help us and remove whatever is destroying us. And they have used this even when it comes to resolving some of the conflicts that they have. Because whether we like it or not, without recourse to indigenous knowledge, I'm afraid that many of the interventions that are being carried out in the DRC, including peacekeeping, they remain exogenous and they don't create peace. Equally, they will not be able to restore governance and security in mining. So what do we mean by indigeneity then? It is I dare to say that it is a return to that African philosophy that Mandela and Tutu and others are talking about. In Africa, we have that Ubuntu philosophy, which values the person, the land, the environment, and whatever is around. How did that get corrupted? People need to rediscover. because without that, I'm afraid that whatever is external will have no roots and will die. Of course, the challenge that we have, even in Congo, is that indigenous philosophy, Ubuntu philosophy, is not written anywhere most of the time. It is in the minds and hearts of the elders. And when you talk to them, many of them will suggest what should be done. Probably we need to interrogate them and put their wisdom into writing. Because, yeah, as I mentioned in my presentation, even when I was doing research, people were saying, okay, you're coming from Canadian universities. Are you sure you are not one of them? Are you sure you're not just colonizing us? At times I have to say, no, I'm just one of you looking for solutions to ensure that the situation gets better. To conclude this, indigeneity remains complex. It requires more and more interrogations, but there are some seeds that are still existing and could be used. And even there to say that probably, I think actually Mbembe suggested that given the crisis that we are facing as a global society, it is high time we go back to those indigenous values, for example, that ensure that resources are shared equally. And I think today COVID is teaching us that nobody will ever be safe until we share resources. Climate change is teaching us the same. That even if we are considering ourselves maybe fenced because we're in the developed world, climate change does not observe borders. Viruses do not observe borders. But there's a lot that we can learn from the indigenous knowledges and the wisdoms. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Evelyn and Blair. And so I think we've got one last question, and that is from Chambi C. We have about 4 minutes left. So Chambi, I'll ask you to ask your question directly to Evelyn.
Thank you. Hello, Eve. I'm teaching a course on the Great Lake region, and we've really been trying to understand the connection between the pre-colonial and colonial. And what we've been observing is that things were not that rosy in the colonial period in that particular area where you are studying, especially in relation to the kingdoms. Like the kings were always like fighting against each other, trying to expand their territory. So can you just help me understand how this indigenous and Ubuntu philosophy worked in that context of rivalries among the kingdoms prior to the colonization? And then the second part, I just wanted to understand why you don't mention the Katanga, the Kasavubu Lumumba dynamics, you just go straight to Mobutu. Thank you.
Thank you. Chambi, I'll start from where you ended. I didn't mention Kasavumbu and Lumumba, etc. because of time. Because that is a long history and it would have taken us very far away. So I left that out. And not only that, I left out even all that violence around independence. I didn't address that. I focused only on a few elements around mining. Going back to the first question that you raised, yes, in the Great Lakes region, but also throughout Africa, kingdoms were fighting against each other. But what was different, for example, I remember among the, the different tribes in the DRC, the elders were telling me that as soon as blood was shed, or as soon as they could see blood that someone has been wounded, the elders had to declare a ceasefire and they had to negotiate. And all communities or tribes, as they call them, had to come together and be reconciled. Instead, today, we are fighting without reconciliation. We are fighting endless wars that nobody has managed to bring to an end. Peacekeepers have been in the DRC since 1999. That's a long time. And up to today, peace remains very, very elusive. Another element that the kingdoms were trying to implement when there was misunderstandings and violence, they could also share resources. For example, if during war, maybe women were starving, the war had to stop. And say, you know what, we cannot go on with this when women are starving. So there was still that humanizing element, even during war. And also you find that although history has it that those wars were many, no, actually wars increased when the colonizers were pitting kingdoms against each other. And this is where then we have that history of the Rwandan genocide, because it was only the colonizers that put the Hutu against the Tutsi. Prior to that, they coexisted peacefully. And you find that the Hutu and the Tutsi were in Rwanda, but also in Burundi, and somewhere in Uganda and the DRC, and they didn't have wars. So then maybe we need to look at that history without that trait of manipulation. We can say more about this maybe when you invite me in your class and I can make a presentation.
Thank you. Yes, we will invite you. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's the perfect note to end things on, since we're now out of time, unfortunately. So I'd like to thank Evelyn very much for your really informative presentation, and thank you for fielding all these excellent questions and comments coming from so many different angles on this huge question. Thank you everybody for being here and taking the time to listen and participate, and we hope to see you at the next Institute of African Studies Brown Bag Seminar, which is going to be on March 9th from 1 until 2:30. So we go back to our regular Wednesday time slot. And Mina Abuku will be speaking, and the title of her presentation is "Why Should I Live by Your Labels and Limitations? Reflections on the Dungeon," which is, she's a creative, she works in theater, so she will be reflecting on that piece, The Dungeon. So I invite everybody, you'll keep an eye out for the information about that talk, and you're more than welcome to come and join us again. Hope you do. So thanks again, everybody, for being here, and stay safe, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.